Christmas is a time to celebrate love, peace, and joy in the company of our loved ones. However, on Christmas Eve in 1945, a furious inferno at a home in Virginia would devastate a Fayetteville family. Tonight, on Dark Curiosities, the disappearance of the Sodder children. George Sodder was born as Giorgio Soddu in Tula, Sardinia, Italy in 1895. When George was 13 years old, accompanied by his older brother, immigrated to the United States. However, he was deserted in America shortly after arriving as his brother swiftly returned to Italy. Interestingly, George never spoke about the reason why he left his native Italy. George took on several jobs whilst adjusting to American life, working on railroads, becoming a truck driver, and later owning his own hauling company. It was in Smithers, West Virginia, where George Sodder met a young woman named Jenny Cipriani, who went on to become his wife. George and Jenny moved to Fayetteville in a 2-story timber-framed dwelling 3 kilometres north of the town, and over the years had 10 children. George's business prospered. However, he was known for being very open about his strong and perhaps controversial views, especially regarding fascism and Benito Mussolini, and he had apparently been involved in arguments about the subject. Even after Mussolini's execution, it appeared bad blood was still present between George and those he had disagreed with. Despite this, however, the family were highly respected by the community. In the October of 1945, George had showed no desire for a life insurance salesman's offer and reported that the man had said to him that the house would go up in smoke and your children are going to be destroyed. George, understandably, was angry about this and asked the man why he would say something so horrible, to which he replied, "The dirty remarks you have been making about Mussolini." Another incident involved a stranger saying to George that the pair of fuse boxes would cause a fire someday. George was puzzled by this remark, as he had just had the house rewired and checked by an electric company. Following this, an electrician checked the wiring once again and told George that everything was in tip-top shape and safe. It is worth noting that the eldest boys of George and Jenny noticed an unusual car, the occupants watching them as they returned from school one day as the Christmas break beckoned. Christmas Eve, 1945. George and Jenny shared festivities and merriment with 9 of their 10 children, their son Joe having been dispatched in the army. With the night aging, George retired to bed, as did his sons John, 23, and George Jr., 16. The younger children begged Jenny to stay up a little longer, as their 17-year-old sister, Marion, had purchased new toys for them. Jenny agreed as long as the children carried out all of their duties before heading to bed. Jenny departed for bed, taking her youngest child, Sylvia, who was 3 at the time, with her. Soon after midnight, Jenny woke from her sleep to hear the phone ringing. Picking up, she heard a voice she did not recognise. It was a female who reportedly had a strange laugh. Jenny hung up, believing it to be a wrong number or possibly just a prank call. Checking on the children, Marion was asleep on the couch. However, the lights were still on and all the doors were still unlocked, which Jenny found unusual as it was part of their routine. She turned the lights off, locked the doors, and climbed back into bed. Moments after closing her eyes, Jenny heard a loud bang on the roof of the property, followed by the sound of something rolling. Originally, she didn't believe it to be anything worth worrying about. At 1:30 a.m, she woke to the smell of smoke. It was then she discovered that the home was aflame. Jenny screamed for her children and husband to escape the house. John and George Jr. made it out of the house with Jenny, George, and little Sylvia. Outside, George realised that 5 of his children were missing. He desperately tried with all of his might to save them. He climbed the wall to the attic and cut himself as he broke a window in an attempt to climb through. He wanted to use the ladder which usually lay propped up against the wall. However, on that fateful night, it had mysteriously vanished. A water barrel, which could have aided in extinguishing the fire, was frozen solid, and despite working the previous day, George could not get either of his trucks to work. Marion tried to alert police, however the phone line appeared to have been cut. She fled to a neighbour's house to raise the alarm. A driver on a nearby road witnessed the flames and called police from a local tavern. However, the call was unsuccessful and appeared not to connect to the operator. The emergency services were eventually contacted through a source, either the neighbour or motorist, as they had managed to finally get through. Over the next 45 minutes, the remaining Sodders could do nothing but watch as their family home burned to the ground, and believed in their hearts that 14-year-old Maurice, 12-year-old Martha, 9-year-old Lewis, 8-year-old Jenny, and 5-year-old Betty had perished in the fire. The fire department were low on numbers due to the war and relied on each firefighter to call each other, so they did not arrive on the scene until much later in the morning. There were only ashes remaining in the basement, and there was no indication of any bones of the missing children. Chief Morris said that his inability to drive that night further hindered their efforts. He also said after investigating the scene that he would have expected to find some form of remains of the missing children. However, there were none. Jenny asked a local crematorium worker about whether it was possible for the fire to burn bone away, as she had already tried to burn animal bones in her grief, desperate to seek answers. Another account, however, says that internal organs and skeletal fragments were found. However, authorities had allegedly kept this from George and Jenny Sodder. The chief had wished to investigate the scene further, but 4 days after the fire, Jenny and George could not bear the sight of the place any longer, and George bulldozed the site to make way for our memorial. The coroner conducted an inquest and concluded that the fire began due to faulty wiring, which both George and Jenny refused to believe. In another cruel twist of fate, among the jurors was the man who had said to George that his children would be destroyed in retribution of his anti-Mussolini remarks. Death certificates were issued on the 30th of December, and a funeral was held for the children on January 2nd, 1946. However, George and Jenny were too grief-stricken to attend. The surviving children did, however, pay their respects. In the following years, Jenny and George continued to search for answers. Jenny had noted that on Christmas Eve, the lights had been working flawlessly. Therefore, an electrical fault seemed most unlikely. The ladder which had gone missing that night was actually found on an embankment 75 feet away from the house. A man who had been arrested for stealing a block and tackle from the house around the time of the fire admitted to cutting the phone wire. However, he believed it was actually the power line. Jenny Sodder said if the power line had been cut, she, along with her husband and children, would never have survived. It was also discovered that the call made to Jenny that night was genuinely a mistake. Throughout the years, numerous sightings and tips were reported. George investigated each one personally and hoped to find a lead. In 1967, the family received a photograph, apparently of an adult Lewis, and indeed George and Jenny believed it was him. On the back, written was, "Lewis Sodder, I love brother Frankie, ill boys, A90132 or 35. The Sodders hired a private investigator to travel to Central City, but he was never heard from again, and he could not be located. George Sodder passed away in 1969, and Jenny Sodder tended to the memorial garden every day and wore black mourning clothes until her death in 1989, and the famous billboard along State Route 16, which showed pictures of the missing Sodders and the $10,000 reward notice for information, was taken down. The remaining surviving Sodder children and their families to this day continue to campaign for their cause. They theorise that there was foul play involving George and the Sicilian mafia, and their siblings simply did not perish in the fire, even though the police concluded that this was most likely the case. Most believe that the lost Sodder children perished in the fire on Christmas Eve in 1945, and the family were just in denial. However, it seems like this case will never truly be solved, and sadly, George and Jenny passed away without ever knowing what happened to their children. It is worth remembering that although Christmas is a time of happiness, for some it is haunted and tinted with sorrow. We enjoy the company of the loved ones we are fortunate enough to have, but also it is a time to remember those who are no longer with us. But, despite loss, memories shall never fade.